Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. Congress is out for its Memorial Day recess, and Senate action on the FY 2025 budget reconciliation bill is expected during the June legislative work period, after the House passed its version last week. Trade and tariffs are back in the news, and here to talk about the implications are Scott McCandless, a principal in PwC's Tax Policy Services practice, and Will Morris, PwC's Global Tax Policy Leader. Scott and Will, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me back after all you said.
All right, so let's get started. And before we dive into tariffs, Scott, I want to ask you about budget reconciliation and where it was left last week, and what are the challenges we're expecting when they come back next week?
There's this wonderful old saying in Washington, D.C., Sindhu, that there's nothing so clarifying as jet fumes. In this case, it was the jet fumes of planes waiting to take members of Congress away for the Memorial Day recess, which Speaker Johnson was threatening by saying, vote on this before you get out of town or you don't get out of town. Well, it worked, as it often does, and they successfully passed the one big, beautiful bill, for which we are still looking for a shortening acronym that rolls off the tongue. They passed that successfully before they left for the Memorial Day recess. So now that both chambers are on recess, as you mentioned, when they come back next week, it's the Senate's turn. So the Senate will pick it up. They have a 4-week work period. It looks like they should be able to complete action on the Senate's version, because they are likely to make changes to it, before the July 4th recess, giving both chambers time in July before the August recess to try to come to some kind of compromise agreement as to what's in, what's out. So it looks like as early as next week. Now, the question in the Senate is whether they're going to go through committee in some kind of regular order, or if they might take the bill directly to the floor and have some kind of floor-based amendment process. The latter is seemingly slightly more likely at this point, although nothing is decided. But it's just going to be an interesting procedural question as they head into debate next week.
All right, thank you for that. And now let's switch over to tariffs. There's been news recently about that as well. So President Trump has made some announcements, one pertaining to China as for an agreement, and then tariffs imposed on the EU, and those have been delayed. But
right.
Where does everything stand?
Sure. So let's start with China. On May 12th, after some negotiations that took place in Switzerland, the U.S. and Chinese governments announced that they were going to both be taking down their tariffs a little bit, not to completely zero. They still have some in place. But essentially, the bottom line for the U.S. tariff is it went from a high of 145%, still kind of a remarkably high number, down to 30%. And the Chinese tariffs go from 125% down to 10% on U.S. goods going into China. Now, this was delayed for 90 days, so on or about August 10th, we'll get a change. Either there will be some kind of further agreement between the two parties to extend or redo their trade relationship that might prevent these tariffs from continuing, might change them further. If nothing is done by that 90-day date, then the U.S. tariffs would go from what is essentially a current 30% up to 54%. So there's still an automatic trigger in there, which presumably will keep some pressure on the two sides to come together. With regard to the European Union, last week, President Trump announced that he would be imposing 50% tariffs starting June 1st, but, and this is a very important but, they almost immediately had conversations with the European Union, which led to a cessation of that tariff going into place until July 9th. So that gives them some time to work this out. What I reflect on a little bit is the recently announced US-UK deal. Now, there has been a lot of criticism from the trade sphere that as much pressure as they want to put on the trade space and as many countries want to get in the queue to talk to them about a trade deal, actually doing fulsome bilateral agreements seems almost impossible just from a logistical standpoint. But the US-UK deal shows that that's not exactly what they're doing. They're just doing very high-level deals. The US-UK deal allows more beef and agricultural products to go into the UK, some deals on automotive and pharmaceutical tariffs. So it's just a bit writ large and further details to be worked out. Presumably something like that could happen between the US and the EU ahead of the July 9th deadline, and that's what we'll be looking for.
And Will, I want to come to you because there's a Pillar 2 question we've got, which is, yes, I know, absolutely surprising. But in negotiations between the US and the EU with respect to Pillar 2, how do the tariff announcements, what is that, even though they're delayed, what is the interaction that's happening there?
Right, well, let me be very clear. Scott is the expert on tariffs, so I don't want to tread too much on that. But look, it's a great question because, and you've heard me say this before, we as tax people are very used to sort of tax driving the bus. And since January the 20th, it's become increasingly clear that tax actually isn't driving the bus, that tariffs and trade are driving the bus. And, taxes in the back, occasionally getting a little sort of travel sick. So, the effect that tariffs can have on this is really quite substantial. And, particularly when it comes to conversations with the EU in particular, because of the president's stated views on this, this is likely to be a prickly issue. And so we have retaliatory legislation moving through in the OBBB, which doesn't, as you say, doesn't trip off the tongue. You have the retaliatory legislation moving through there. You have the possibility of tariffs over here. There is no way that cannot affect the talks which are going on about a slightly more technical tax solution. Although to be very clear, at this point, these are political discussions about how we deal with these issues which have lingered over Pillar 2 almost from the very beginning. But Treasury and the EU are talking. Although again, to be very clear, the EU has said, as a result of a meeting they had a couple of weeks ago, the OECD has to handle this. Now, why did they say that? Not necessarily because of huge confidence, that the OECD should be running all of this, but nevertheless, partly it may be that some countries in the EU do not want to be seen as the first movers here. They want the OECD to do that. And the other reason, which is slightly more technical, is that there are arguments that if the OECD agrees at the inclusive framework level to do something, then the EU can do it under the directive without needing to change the directive. Whereas if they agreed it directly, they might need to change the directive. But those conversations at a tax level do seem to be continuing. They seem to be relatively positive. I think there's a fair amount of mutual understanding on both sides, at least from what I hear. So if this were a tax thing alone, I'd be relatively confident that there could be a solution.
Okay,
but it isn't.
And so the Treasury has been quite vocal about these negotiations. So what does the U.S. want?
So let's break this down into 3 is always a perfect number. So let's break it down into 3 things. So the first, and in a sense most obvious one, is this problem which has been with us for Pillar 2 since at least 2021, which is that because of the differences between the US tax base and the Pillar 2 tax base, and in particular the way non-refundable credits are a big part of the US tax system, US domestic income could be subject to the UTPR, the undertaxed profit rule, being imposed on foreign subs of US parents in other countries to make up what Pillar 2 deems to be a shortfall below a 15% ETR in the US. That was never going to work. I mean, that in so many senses is just a totally outrageous proposition. It is pure extraterritorial taxation. You are not taxing income which has arisen in your country, and you're imposing it via a formula, which I might add is quite favorable to rich countries, on subs in other countries. So that was never going to work. There is currently a 1-year UTPR, UPE, ultimate parent entity jurisdiction safe harbor. The basic idea is that just continues forever, or for 4 years, whichever may be the shorter. So that's point 1. Point 2, which has grown in importance since the election. I think before the election, some businesses did not think they would get this, is how do you deal with the UTPR? Again, this charge for where there's taxation of less than 15, an ETR of less than 15%. How do you deal with that at the US sub level? Because across the chain somewhere, somebody's not paying tax at 15%.
Right.
Well, so what the conversations which have been going on actually harken back to very early in this, 2017, 18, 19, when people talked about guilty being grandfathered. Sufficient analysis was not made at that time of what those words meant. But essentially what this is, hey, we had guilty first, okay? We have a minimum tax regime. We don't need this too. Obviously that changed under the Biden administration, but this administration is going back to the point, guilty is actually quite a tough regime. And it's good enough in the context of the rest of the US regime. So let's have guilty and Pillar 2 sit alongside each other. And if you are subject to guilty as a US headquartered business, you will not be subject to Pillar 2 at all, okay? So that means that at the lower tier levels, even if you're a sub in a country where others would otherwise impose the UTPR because there isn't an income inclusion rule up or whatever it is, that it won't apply. So essentially it means that US businesses, US subs and the parents in US businesses will not be subject to Pillar 2 at all. So the UTPR will not apply at all in those circumstances. And at one level, that is actually a quite reasonable thing to ask for. So that's 1, UPE jurisdiction, 2, across chain. The third element is the QDMTT. So that's the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax, which is the tax that other, the countries lower down the chain can impose to ensure that other countries aren't sucking up, some of their revenue under the UTPR. Too many acronyms there. At least they're all the same acronym essentially. So, the issue here is what should happen? And here the administration has been slightly less clear. It's clear that some people would like this to mean that guilty taxes can be pushed down and take priority over the QDMTT, which would allow, obviously, for a slightly better result for US businesses. There are others who say, well, maybe we should be out of the QDMTT. And there's another element of it, so there is really a fourth, even though 3 is the perfect number, which is what do we do about reporting? The Globe Information Return is, I have no problem saying this publicly, it is a monstrously complicated return, far more complicated than it needs to be. Tax authorities are recognizing that, as well as businesses. So there is an ask that if you're not in Pillar 2, you don't need to file the Globe Information Return. There's a sort of hangover point, which is you can still be subject to a QDMTT, which essentially is just a top-up, the country's raised its rates. What about the reporting there? That is, it's unclear exactly what's going to happen there. But that's basically what it is. The US says, take us out of the ultimate parent entity, take us out of the cross-chain UTPR, and make some changes around the reporting, and let's see about the QDMTT.
So, Will, before we close, I do have one final question, and I want to bring it back to budget reconciliation. You are all over the globe. Mm-hmm. What are you hearing about this legislation, and what if any, interest is there in this legislation?
The interest is huge but narrow, or maybe narrow but huge. And obviously, it relates to the 2 pieces, Section 899, what's going to happen with that, and also BEAT. And actually, surprisingly, BEAT, or surprisingly to me, BEAT is actually getting more attention because the expansion of that could hit some businesses massively.
All right, thank you for that.
You bet.
All right, and thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Cindy.
And a note for our viewers, there is a tax readiness webcast coming up this Thursday on IRS updates and the tax controversy landscape. You won't want to miss that. Thanks as always for spending this time with us. Take care.